Here's a question. Can the price of bread bring down an entire empire? It sounds strange, but it actually happened. The year was 1917. The place was Russia. And an empire that had stood for 300 years collapsed simply because people couldn't get bread. Hello, everyone. Today we're talking about the era when a new idea was rising in Europe. An idea that eventually built the largest political experiment the world had ever seen. But we're not going to walk through this as a textbook timeline. Today, we're going to see it through the eyes of three ordinary people: a factory worker, a peasant, and a soldier. What did these three have in common? All three worked hard. All three went hungry, and none of them had a voice. Let's begin this journey, but from a different door than usual. First, let's meet the worker. Call him Ivan. Ivan wakes up at 4 in the morning and walks to the factory in the dark. There he works for 14 hours, surrounded by machine noise, smoke, and heat. By the end of the day, he earns just enough to fill his stomach. Saving anything is out of the question. The factory he works in doesn't belong to him. The profit doesn't land in his pocket. It lands in the owner's mansion. Now here's the thing. This wasn't a lone story. In 19th century Europe, there were millions of Ivans in every city, in every factory. The Industrial Revolution had brought machines, but along with them, it had brought a new kind of servitude. Now let's meet the peasant, and we'll call him Peter. Peter's life was strange in its own way. He plowed the land, sowed the seeds, harvested the crop. But the land wasn't his. It belonged to a landlord who lived comfortably in the city. Peter had to pay taxes and rent just to work that land. By year's end, what little was left barely lasted until the next harvest. Think about it. What kind of system leaves the person who tills the soil the hungriest of all? And the third character is the soldier. Let's call him Dmitri. Dmitri had been forced into the army. He was told he was fighting for his country, for his Tsar. But he didn't have proper boots, warm clothes, and sometimes not even enough rifles to go around for his unit. Ivan, Peter, and Dmitri, together, they're really a snapshot of the entire generation standing at the bottom of Europe's ladder. So the question becomes, with so many people suffering, where did the idea of change actually come from? The answer lies in a handful of books and a handful of restless minds. A new idea was spreading across Europe, that maybe it's wrong for property to belong to just one person. Maybe factories, land, and resources should belong to everyone, since everyone is putting in the labor. This idea got a name: socialism. But here's something worth understanding clearly. Socialism wasn't an idea that showed up overnight. It simmered for years, like a fire that smolders quietly before it finally catches. The French Revolution had already taught Europe that ordinary people could challenge a king. Then, the Industrial Revolution created an entirely new class: the working class. This class was gathering in cities, all in one place, all sharing the same misery. And when people gather in one place, ideas spread faster too. This is where the real story begins. Some believed change should come slowly, through law, through dialogue. Others believed the system itself needed to break, and a new one had to rise in its place. Two names became famous for pushing that second idea: Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Together, they wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto. It carried a line that echoed across the world: "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." That wasn't just a slogan. It was a warning to every king and factory owner who assumed this order would last forever. From here, we leave the rest of Europe behind and head straight to Russia, because Russia is where this idea stopped living only in books and walked out onto the streets. Russia, at the time, was one of the most backward of the world's major powers. Its ruler, Tsar Nicholas II, believed he was chosen by God himself. No one was allowed to question his word. There was no parliament, no court that could challenge his decisions. 85% of Russia's population were peasants, yet most of the land sat in the hands of a small circle of wealthy families. And in the few factory towns that existed, like St. Petersburg and Moscow, workers' conditions were even worse than in the rest of Europe. Stop and think for a second. In a country with this much poverty and inequality, where else would revolution first take root? That's exactly why Russia became the most fertile ground for the socialist idea. But the revolution didn't arrive out of nowhere. Several warnings came before it. In 1905, an event happened that history remembers as Bloody Sunday. Thousands of unarmed workers, including women and children, marched peacefully toward the Tsar's palace. Their demands were simple: shorter working hours, better wages, and the right to vote. In response, they were met with gunfire. Hundreds were killed right there in the streets. This wasn't just a massacre. It was a shattered trust. The Tsar people had worshipped like a god had just ordered his own soldiers to shoot them. Afterward, the Tsar tried a clever move. He created a parliament called the Duma. But the moment that Parliament questioned his authority, he dissolved it. This cycle repeated. Parliaments formed and were broken while real power stayed firmly in the Tsar's hands. People's anger was suppressed but never extinguished. It kept smoldering underneath like embers hiding under ash. And then came 1914 when the First World War began. In the beginning, Russians were swept up in patriotic pride. believing the war was for the nation's honor. But within months, that enthusiasm began to crack. Russian soldiers lacked proper weapons and warm clothing, while the German army came equipped with modern machine guns. Picture millions of soldiers like Dmitri fighting in frozen fields without boots, without enough rifles, armed with nothing but sheer will. By 1917, over 7 million Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded. While soldiers died at the front, things back home were falling apart just as fast. Factory workers had been sent off to fight, and production ground to a halt. Railway lines were breaking down, and grain supplies were being diverted entirely to the army. Long bread lines formed in the cities, and often people went home with nothing. Here's where an interesting twist enters the story. Tsar Nicholas had left for the front, leaving his wife and his advisor Rasputin in charge back in the capital. Rumors spread among the public that the two of them were ruining the country. Think about the contrast. Soldiers freezing to death at the front, peasants stripped of their land, workers going to bed hungry, while the palace stayed lit up in luxury. That gap had become impossible to bear. In February 1917, in the city of Petrograd, a single factory shuts its doors. The workers go on strike. The next day, workers from 50 more factories join them in solidarity. And leading this entire movement were women, who poured into the streets on International Women's Day carrying banners that read, "Give us bread." The government imposed a curfew and ordered the army to open fire. But this time, something different happened. Most soldiers refused to obey the order. They said, "These are our own brothers and sisters. We will not shoot them." And then the soldiers did something unthinkable. They joined the rebels themselves. The very army that had kept the Tsar in power for 300 years now stood against him. Within days, Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate. A 300-year-old Romanov dynasty collapsed within a single week. But the story doesn't end here. The real confusion was just beginning. The Tsar was gone, but who would actually run the country? Russia suddenly found itself with two centers of power. On one side stood the provisional government, formed by wealthy elites and former parliament members. On the other stood the Petrograd Soviet, a council formed by workers and soldiers themselves. One held the official seal of government, the other held the genuine trust of the people. It was like one house with two owners, each ignoring the other. Into this confusion returns a man who had spent years in exile, Vladimir Lenin. When Lenin came back, he said plainly, "This is not the time to cooperate with the provisional government." He gave the people a slogan that was simple but powerful: peace, land, and bread. Those three words captured the exact struggles of the three characters we started with. Ivan needed bread, Peter needed land, and Dmitri needed peace from the war. That's precisely why the slogan landed straight in people's hearts. On a night in October 1917, with barely any bloodshed, Bolshevik supporters quietly seized control of the city's key buildings. Telephone exchanges, railway stations, government offices, all fell under their control. A single blank shot, fired from a ship, signaled the assault on the Winter Palace, and the ministers of the provisional government were arrested. Power changed hands in a single night. Russia became the first country in the world where a socialist government took power. But seizing power was one thing. Holding on to it was an entirely different challenge. Lenin moved fast, making several major decisions almost immediately. First, Russia was pulled out of the First World War. Second, major industries and banks were placed under government control. Third, landlords' estates were seized and distributed among the peasants. It sounds like a dream come true, doesn't it? A share of the factory for the worker, land for the peasant, and an end to the war for the nation. But, like every revolution, this one carried a darker layer underneath. Anyone who opposed the new government was crushed without mercy. A secret police force was set up to silence any voice of dissent. The promise of freedom had arrived hand in hand with a brutal new form of control. What followed was a devastating civil war that lasted 3 years. On one side were the Bolshevik supporters, known as the Reds. On the other were those who wanted the old order back, backed by foreign powers like Britain, France, and the United States. These countries feared that if socialism succeeded in Russia, the fire might spread into their own nations too. Millions died in this civil war, and famine and disease made the devastation even worse. In the end, the Bolsheviks won, because they had a clear vision and had already secured the loyalty of the peasants. By 1922, the old Russian Empire had been reshaped entirely under a new name, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. After Lenin's death, power passed to Joseph Stalin. Stalin took an extremely harsh approach. Peasants' private lands were seized and merged into collective farms known as kolkhozes. Those who resisted were crushed without hesitation. In the 1930s, a devastating famine struck, killing millions of people. Now pause for a moment and think. Ivan, Peter, and Dmitri, the very people in whose name this entire revolution had been fought, did they actually receive the freedom they dreamed of? The answer isn't that simple. On one hand, the USSR transformed a backward nation into a global superpower within just a few decades. Education reached every household, unemployment dropped, and industry grew at a staggering pace. On the other hand, freedom of speech was crushed, and dissent was punished with prison or death. This story teaches us that no great transformation ever comes without complications. A revolution that arrives carrying hope often carries a heavy price along with it, and its impact wasn't limited to Russia alone. Workers' movements across the world drew fresh energy from this revolution. Freedom fighters in colonized nations, including India, found inspiration in it as well. In the decades that followed, the world split into two camps: capitalism on one side, socialism on the other. This wasn't just a battle of weapons, it was a battle of ideas. So that's the story of an era when hunger, poverty, and injustice together shook an empire to its foundation. A story that reminds us that when an ordinary person's voice is silenced long enough, it eventually breaks through. If this perspective resonated with you, let me know your thoughts. See you in the next story.